Since we're in 2025, that means we are halfway through the 2020s decade, which really blows my mind that we're already saying that. It feels like yesterday COVID was a thing. It was 2020. We are all stuck in our houses watching streaming movies, but now it's 2025 and we've already had 4 years of some fabulous movies. And in today's video, what I want to dive into is talk about my top 20 films so far for this decade. I definitely want to hear your guys' thoughts down below. This was a hard list to nail down, and the way that I kind of nailed it down was just what were the films that I went home raving to my family, raving to my friends. You have to check this out. This is this list. You might not agree with everything on this list. You might think that other films deserve to be on this list, and partially even the placement of this. Certain films in here I kind of personally probably would have put a little bit higher, but I really thought about also what they did for the zeitgeist. What did they do for the genre of film that it was in? This is definitely going to be a fun list. I can't wait to hear your guys' thoughts down below, and without further ado, let's get into this. Starting out at my number 20 is a Best Picture winner, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. I didn't really expect much going into this movie, and a lot of that kind of just comes from I didn't watch the trailers, I stayed away from a lot of the marketing, and all I knew was the guys who made Swiss Army Man are making this film. Okay, that intrigues me, and it might have a little bit of a multiverse angle. Okay, A24 doing a multiverse film with the guys who made Swiss Army Man, which is a film that I was a massive fan of. And I walked out of that movie going, holy shit, that was such an experience. And it was one of the few films that I had to take my wife to, I had to take my friends to, I had to tell every single person I knew to watch this movie. Not because of how bonkers and insane it is, which is one of the reasons, but I think all of that is a lot of fun, but also how emotionally resonating the movie is. And I still hold to the standard that I can't believe it was a Best Picture winner. I can't believe Everything Everywhere All at Once took all those awards, and it deserved every single one of them. But it is one of those films that really just takes your breath away from the energy, from the livelihood. And what I love about it is the first half really establishes everything kind of going on in a fun way with some emotional depth here and there. But in the most point of it, it's a very fun movie. The action set pieces are great. It's insane. Then the back half kicks in. And while it still has some of that, all of that emotional, thematical simplicity that the first half had, where it was everything, and then it went everywhere, and then it went all at once. Literally, it's so broken up in that. But by the end, you kind of just have this emotional roller coaster, just this giant tidal wave surface over you. You feel satisfied. You feel emotionally resonated with its characters as it all goes back to one climactic moment in this character's life. And for me, that was just brilliant. I think every single person in here is great, and overall this is one of those films that I think for the 2020s, it's a must-see film. Talking about other must-see films from A24, at my number 19 is The Green Knight. Now, I'm a massive fan of David Lowery. I know sometimes he's hit or miss for many, but The Green Knight was one of those films that when I saw Dave Patel was going to be in this, and it's going to be kind of a King Arthurian tale, okay, yes, I'm going to be there first day, and The Green Knight took my breath away. It's one of those beautiful, touching medieval films that characterize what a fantasy and in general a folk tale could be. And I think The Green Knight is one of those movies that I've really much cherished that I have not actually gone back and rewatched it at home. It's only a film that I saw twice in theaters and I haven't seen since, but I still think about it to this day as one of my favorite A24 movies. It's one of those movies that when I was making this list, I knew it had to be at least my top 20 because when I left the theater, visually it was breathtaking. But the journey that I took along the way was one that I just wanted to talk about with other people, and The Green Knight for me is a must-see movie. We get into my number 18, which is Christopher Nolan's Tenet. Now, I think no matter who you are, I know this film when it came out, a lot of people just didn't really like it. I think people thought it was overly confusing, it was going a little bit too far out there, but I've been a fan since day one. And I think I've seen this film about 4 or 5 times in theaters, but I just got done seeing it last year when they did the re-release in IMAX, and it was the best experience. And also experiencing it with probably a ton of people who had never gotten to see the film in theaters was also a breathtaking feature. Tenet is one of my personal favorite Nolan films. A lot of it being, in a way, it is his James Bond. I like the spy espionage. I like how he's culminating and bringing this whole entire film together. And again, as I left the theater, every single time I've told people, you need to watch fucking Tenet. This is a cinematic feature and one that Nolan just crafts with such beauty and such thrilling. And the performances are incredible in here. John David Washington is great as protagonist, but I think Robert Pattinson steals so much of this show. And again, if there was ever a possibility of getting a Tenet 2, this is the one that I would want to see. Especially like out of all the Nolan original films, this is the one that I think needs a sequel. Get into my number 17. I think this film is streaming currently on Hulu right now, so definitely go check it out if it is. But that is Another Round. I put it this way, that this is Mads Mikkelsen's The Hangover, but in a more dramatic way. It's still a fun movie, but it really takes the seriousness of how alcohol can affect someone's life. I think for me, like that point of view and the way that Another Round takes its whole point of view on it is the fact that it does take its ideas and does not like simplify them in any way. And I think Another Round is just one of those beautiful, touching films that again has humor to it, but definitely has it in one of the darkest spots of a person's life. And basically the whole premise, if people don't know, it is about 4 friends who are like teachers and everyday people who decide to see what their breaking point is with alcohol. How can alcohol affect their lives for the better? But also you see that maybe they see this point of view as showing how great it is. What's the other point of view of what they're actually doing is wrong? And we get into my number 16, and this is Poor Things. Now, I know there's a lot of people who have poor taste in this movie and just in general aren't a fan of Poor Things, and I completely understand. Yorgos is a very, I think you either get it or you don't type of thing with him. And for me, I, for the most part, love a lot of Yorgos Lanthimos movies, not Kinds of Kindness. I appreciated it, but definitely didn't love it. Poor Things for me is my favorite movie of his, and it's also my favorite Emma Stone performance. I think the fact that this is kind of like a Disney princess fairy tale in the most like extreme manners of a princess kind of like discovering who she is through her sexuality, and as well as just after being locked away, I feel like that can really much be to so many people in today's standards who feel like they're beaten down on one path, who don't get to explore themselves into every other standard, just exploring our world and not knowing any other viewpoints. And Poor Things kind of just opens the horizon for one character. And for me, the way that Emma Stone takes this character is one of my favorite characters of the 2020s. It's such an original take, and I love that it's kind of like Frankenstein mixed with, again, like this humorous kind of Yorgos Lanthimos humor. I think it's insane, and it's also one of the movies this decade that, for people who like Yorgos or like this type of movie, I could not stop recommending it enough, and it was one of my favorites of that year, and it's still one of my favorites of the entire decade. Then we get into my number 15, and that is 9 Days. Now, 9 Days is a very small film, most likely the smallest film on this list, and honestly, to a lot of you, you've probably never even heard about this movie, but it stars Winston Duke, Zazie Beetz, Bill Skarsgård, and it is one of the most poetic and beautiful, touching movies of this entire year. For me, if you ask me what movie symbolizes the meaning of life, I would either say 9 Days or Soul, which also came out in the same year, and Soul almost made the top 20, but I wanted to only include one of them, and 9 Days is the one that kind of like has captivated me. And the basic premise is Winston Duke plays a spirit, an angel, who decides what spirit moves on to live. And it's like an interview process of 9 days. And the entire concept, the entire like ideology of how all this is built up is just so beautiful and so wonderful. But it's the thematics, the points, the meaning of life, what this film has to say. I saw this film at Sundance the year it came out, and from then on, it's still been my zeitgeist and been in my memory, and it's been one of my favorite films that I highly, highly recommend. If you are just wanting or need something to tell you what the meaning of life is, or just maybe in general have like a different point of view on that, I think 9 Days is the perfect film for you. My number 14 is Furiosa, a Mad Max saga. Now, you guys all failed this movie, like hands down. If you didn't see this movie in theaters, I am very disappointed in you, especially if like once you got to see it on streaming, you enjoyed it, or in general, you liked Mad Max Fury Road. There is no like understanding, like, well, I understand in the zeitgeist of why Furiosa bombed at the box office, but for me, it didn't deserve that at all. I thought Furiosa And I still think this today, at least today I do, that this is the best top 3 prequel movies ever made. And I would say that this makes Fury Road a better movie, and that now going forward, I will never be able to watch just Fury Road. I will watch Furiosa and then do my marathon of going into Fury Road. Like that, all behind the scenes of Mad Max, you've always kind of understood a little bit of the wasteland and the world that they're living in, but Furiosa takes it a little bit deeper. And it's different than any other Mad Max film that we've ever encountered. Yes, it has the wildness, the insanity, the action, which is just fucking pure perfect, but it also has character depth. And that character depth really dives into the world of Mad Max itself, Bullet Town, the societies, Immortan Joe, and how these societies run. And I thought that was all just so wonderful. And Chris Hemsworth delivers maybe my favorite performance of his entire career. Anya Taylor-Joy is phenomenal here. But shout out to the little girl who played the younger version of her. She was also exceptional in this. I just think Fury Road, a Mad Max saga, deserves so much better. And it's one of my favorite films of this decade. Number 13 is Anora, another film from last year, which for me kind of surprised me. I've always really liked Sean Baker as a director. I appreciate more of his films than love them, and I appreciate him more as a director than I love his features, but Anora for me was my favorite film of his so far. I think Mikey Madison is incredible in this, and I think in a way Anora is Pretty Woman with Uncut Gems mixed together, but in the more R-rated tone of Pretty Woman. And I think the thing that really comes away from this, and one thing that I really liked is, if Poor Things is kind of like exploring your point of view and your world from a princess outlook, Anora is that princess dream that so many women and also like men like dream of, that kingdom, that feeling like a prince type of story from rags to riches that so many people want to feel. And Anora kind of gets that outlook. But then I like how the middle of the film kind of strips that away and takes it into a different depressing outlook, that when you get to the final few moments of the film, it really just goes, fuck. And it hard hits. And the way that the ending plays out, it was one of those things that I love the movie, and then the ending starts to happen. I'm like, I don't know if I like that. And then the way it ends, like 30 seconds right before it ends, the twist of Mikey Madison's performance right there made me go, I get it. And I loved it. And this is, again, as of last year, one of those films that I just couldn't stop recommending to people. And we get into my number 12, which is Past Lives, another film that I highly recommended to every single person the year it came out, and I'm still recommending to this day. My wife's still at home on maternity leave, and every single time she asks me what she should watch, Past Lives always ends up on that list. And I know one day she's going to watch it, and she's going to love it. And I think for me, what Past Lives kind of symbolizes is us, again, like no pun intended, looking at our past lives, things in our past that kind of affect us and how they made us come to be and who we are. And while the performances are amazing, I cannot wait to see what the director does next. I think her next film is with Pedro Pascal and Chris Evans, which is just going to be so cool to see both of them in there. But this is a movie that emotionally resonated me. It was beautifully created and crafted, and I feel like everyone has someone in their life like this that really like symbolizes them, but also was like the turning point of like what that person made them become and how it affects their further relationships as well as their further friendships, romances, whatever it may be, maybe even your career. But Past Lives was a film for me that I thought was incredible, and it made me love more of where I'm at in life. And I just can't appreciate this film more than I could say. Then we get into my number 11, which I'm so happy that Brady Corbett actually discussed the AI thing, because I was really afraid to get to this once I had it in almost my top 10, but that is The Brutalist. I know there's been a lot of talk about the AI stuff. I'm not going to talk about that because we genuinely don't know, but it seems like that's been cleared up. The Brutalist is a monumental masterpiece. I think for some people it'll probably be even higher up on this list. The only reason it's not in my top 10 personally is because it didn't make my top 10 last year. And as well, I've only seen the film one time. It's a long movie. It's like 3 hours and 45 minutes. It's got an intermission. It's got all of it. But it's one of those cinematic epics that people will be talking about 20, 30, 40 years from now. And I believe like that a majority of these films that I'm talking about, people are going to be talking about 30, 40 years from now. Maybe at least the top 15 more-ish. But The Brutalist for me is a film that Oscar baity on the sounds of it. I was excited to see what it is, but I didn't know if it was going to grip me. And from the opening 10 minutes, I'm sucked into this world. And seeing the pursuit of an immigrant in the American dream after post-World War II. It's really, really emotional. It's riveting to all demands. And that runtime, while it does feel, you do definitely feel by the end, it's a movie that I think the intermission is put in such a perfect part where it's like the transition and the changing of one person's life, but as well as the changing of the entire story and the dynamic of everyone around. And if you still haven't seen The Brutalist, I know it's finally starting to go a little bit wider. I can't recommend this one enough. Get into my number 10, which is Top Gun Maverick. Now, again, as a cinematic box office venture, this is one of those films that you just had to see in the theaters. And it's another one of those few ones that I have not watched at home. I just don't know if I ever will. I'm sure I will, but I don't want to. I don't want to lose that feeling, that momentum that I got to see in the theaters with it. And it sucks because it was a very busy year for me that year, just in terms of scheduling. So we only got to see this one like 3 times in theaters, where a lot of people got to see it like 8, 12 times. But it was such a magical journey, and it's one that I'm so happy Tom Cruise got to do, because I've always liked the first Top Gun, but like I felt Top Gun Maverick, while basically the same story, doubles down and opens up so many ideas and ventures on growing in your career, growing as a person, growing in symbolism and how much that adds to it. And I find that so many of the things in this story are poignant and perfect. And as much as people go to this for the action, the thrilling nature of it, I mean, it is truly a cinematic delight. I'm so impressed with also just the simplistic story that they have in here and how it emotionally resonates you. And out of a lot of the films of this past decade, I think Top Gun Maverick is one film that like made a lot of people bond together. Get into my number 9, which is Killers of the Flower Moon. Again, another very long movie that I have only seen a handful of times, but it is one that when it came out in theaters, I said, you guys should all go see it. You guys skipped it. So when it went on Apple, I said, you guys should all go see it. You guys should stream it. You guys should rent it. You guys should do whatever you can to have the means to watch Killers of the Flower Moon, because I think this is actually one of Martin Scorsese's best movies yet. I said that. This guy has made masterpiece after masterpiece, but Killers of the Flower Moon is probably in my top 10 of his. And personally, for me, he's one of my favorite directors, if not my favorite director of all time. So Killers of the Flower Moon just hit all those levels. And I think also, again, the way that it handles Native Americans and tragically, like, making you hate, like, the main character of the story. It's such a terrible thing, but it's always blown my mind how Killers of the Flower Moon handled all that in such a demeanor, but also the fact that Lily Gladstone, who I think is, like, out of all the performances of this decade, top 5 performances. Like, it was one of those years where if Emma Stone or her had won, I wouldn't have cared, but I maybe would have sided with Lily Gladstone because she was so phenomenal in Killers of the Flower Moon that I was just so impressed. And again, this is a film that still sticks in the back of my head. Randomly, I'll think about it. I think it's an amazing movie that if you haven't seen yet, you should. Into my number 8, a lot of people, it seems like half the people who watched this hated this movie and half the other people really enjoyed it. And that is Babylon. Damien Chazelle, I think, is a master creator when it comes down to anything. A lot of his movies I've given 10 out of 10s to. I think First Man was amazing. I think La La Land is a masterpiece, one of my favorite films of all time. I think Whiplash is incredible as well. And Babylon, like, building up to the hype, my friend who'd seen it early said it's basically Wolf of Wall Street meets Great Gatsby, meets all these different things in like alongside a little bit of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. So all that got me excited because I love all those movies and all those stories. And the more that I've watched Babylon, because I've started this tradition that every New Year's it has to be like one of my first film of the year or like my second film, whatever time I have it. And I've watched just Babylon again. Like, I've celebrated ringing in the new year with watching Babylon either on New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. And I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it, but I love the structure of this movie so much. Every single time I watch it, I gain a more found appreciation for it, that this is one of those movies that is slowly rising into my favorites of all time. And it's not just from the amazing performances from like Margot Robbie, Diego Calva, Brad Pitt, the entire cast, honestly, but it really is Damien Chazelle's direction and how audacious and wild and insane he goes. The humor is there, but the way that it builds up this structure of all these heroes and or heroes, but all these actors and actresses during this time, and how all these artists are trying to do something, and all the rise and fall through this period of Hollywood, and how sometimes it's like, do you want to go against your morals or do you want to go with your morals? Are you an aging actor who is going to be able to get it through the talkies and get past, not being a silent actor or silent film anymore? Are you going to be able to do this and producing? And while it does all of that, it builds up the detriment of how Hollywood can suck you in and spit you back out. And I love how fun the film is, but how fast it dives into the deepest, treacherous dirtiness of that industry. And I think Damien Chazelle just nails it. I think in 10, 20 years, we're all going to be hailing Babylon. We get into my number 7, and that is The Substance. The Substance, for me, is the best horror film so far of this decade. It was really close putting Doc to Me in here because I also love that. But The Substance is just another one of those movies that I walked away from, and the first thing I thought of, anyone could watch this. They might think it's too long, but I think they'll enjoy it. And I think something will resonate and speak to them. And Coralie Farget, who is the director of this, I'm probably mispronouncing that, does such an amazing job directing this movie. The fact that in a way it's like a whole opinion on us, like who we look at each other in the mirror. When we look at ourselves in the mirror, what do we think about? All those inner thoughts, all those inner monologues, but spewed out into a body horror genre, is so grotesque, so nasty, so gory, so bloody, but so amazing at the same time. Demi Moore gives one of my favorite performances of this year. I think she's probably going to win the Oscar. I hope she does. I think out of just all the performances between her or Mikey Madison, I'd be so happy for either one of them. Margaret Qualley, I think, is also incredible in this. But for me, I think The Substance lands on the director's feet, the directing and writing. Again, the film is completely overly long. But for me, I never had an issue with that. I'm so excited to revisit this one once my 4K Blu-ray comes in, which should be any day now as I'm recording this. But I'm excited to watch The Substance again. But now we get into my number 6, and my number 6 is The Batman. I think this is personally, for me, the second best comic book movie of the decade so far. After I got done watching that, I raved to every single person, you need to see this version of The Batman. This to a ton of people also who weren't the biggest fan or were kind of falling off the comic book movie train, and I still debate this with certain friends who are just shit on comic book movies. They're like, I just don't get it. I'm like, well, did you ever see The Batman? They're like, no. And I'm like, you need to watch it. It's a 3-hour crime epic that, yes, has Batman at the center of the story, but in a way it is basically Matt Reeves' Seven. And I love the usage of that. I love how he builds up this world of Gotham City, and I love how Robert Pattinson portrays Batman. I like that a majority of this film, he is not Bruce Wayne. He is literally Batman doing his investigating duties. And for me, I think this is the best Batman movie ever made. I think this is one of the best comic book movies ever made. I cannot wait for part 2. Everything about this movie just nails it. And as a cinematic delight, when his Batmobile revs up, it is still top 5 moments in the theaters this decade right now. The sound design was impeccable. The cinematography, everything about it was amazing. And I think just The Batman is genuinely one of the best films of this decade. Genuine, I just love this film so much. We get into my number 5, and that is The Wild Robot, a film that I was excited for, but didn't know what to expect from. And I walked out a sobbing mess with such a delight that I loved it. I bought all the books. I'm going to read them to my son. And I don't know if this film just hit me at that right perfect point where I knew I was going to become a dad. There's a lot of parental aspects to this, but it also just kind of nails everything about it. Humor, emotion, the parenting side of stuff. It's dark. It has dark humor to it. It doesn't, there's something here for every single person. It's beautifully animated, genuinely. And Chris Sanders does an amazing job directing this. And I think as someone who created my favorite Disney animated film of all time, Lilo and Stitch, did an amazing job with How to Train Your Dragon, and now has The Wild Robot under his hand. I almost want to go as far to say that The Wild Robot is one of the best animated films ever created. I personally still think it's the best DreamWorks film ever created. On an emotional level, this film just resonated with me. Last year when people asked me, what should I go see? Whether they had a family, whether they didn't, I always said, go see The Wild Robot. And there's a reason that it was almost my favorite film of last year. It was primarily because of all that. The film only grows on you. Yes, on a surface level attempt, the animation is gorgeous. There's a lot of good jokes. It's fun. But on a deeper meaning, if you ask me personally, I just genuinely think The Wild Robot is one of the deepest animated films we've had in quite a while that can resonate with kids and parents alike. Thinking about parenting, at my number 4 is Avatar: The Way of Water. Now, I know a lot of people shit on the Na'vi and shit on James Cameron and shit on Pandora and Avatar itself, but I am an Avatar head, so I had to include this on here. This is a film that I saw, I think, 6 times in theaters. 6 times in theaters. And a lot of that was like in the first week and a half. Now, I was genuinely lucky that they did like 3 or 4 press screenings for this. I went to every single fucking one because I wanted to see this movie. I wanted to experience it. And then immediately afterwards, I had plans to see it with my wife. I had plans to see it with my mother-in-law. I had plans to see it with one of my best friends. And it was just that same thing that I just wanted to keep going back to Pandora. I wanted to keep taking people back to the world of Pandora. And I didn't get that zeitgeist when the first Avatar had come out. I really liked it when I first seen it, but I never went back. And then over the years, I kind of grew a little bit more towards Pandora and what James Cameron did with that IP. And again, yes, I know it's built off a lot of the past and a lot of different ideas of stories, but I love that world so much, and I love what James Cameron was able to do. So when the re-release came out, I went back, and that just totally enwrapped me and turned me into a Pandora head. And then when the sequel came out, I just became insufferable. I love this movie so much. I think it's better than the first one in almost every avenue. I think emotionally it's resonating. I think it's the visual effects, if you can believe it, are even better. It's action-packed. I think the third act is so goosebump-inducing. And this is the testament to it. When I got to see it at home, because this was a big thing. Was it a theater experience, or was I could watch it at home and still feel the same way? When I got to watch it at home and I felt that same way, I felt solidified in my opinions, and I will defend this film for the rest of my life. Again, we're talking about my favorite films of the 2020s decade. You might not think this is one of your favorites. You might think something else should be on here. But when I'm talking about films that I cinematically couldn't stop recommending to people, Avatar: The Way of Water was one of those. Speaking about other films that I kept recommending throughout this entire decade, or just in general when it came out, Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer for me was a masterpiece beyond belief. I think there's a lot of argument to be said that this is Christopher Nolan's best movie yet. Personally, for me, it's not, but I think I would not argue against you if you said, yeah, Oppenheimer is his best movie. And the fact that he went out and made a 3-hour drama that flies by and became a cinematic and box office achievement in IMAX theaters. And the fact that it made it worth it to go see it in 70 millimeter IMAX, to like make that attempt, to make that time, was unlike anything I'd ever felt. And I think what Christopher Nolan pulls off here is he showcases that dramas can be intense. They can be riveting from all manners, no matter how long they are. And this goes towards the general going audience. And again, the fact that Oppenheimer, like, you go through this entire story, see this man's life, see what he created. And while people complained, yes, people complained that you didn't see the bomb go off. Again, this is from Oppenheimer's perspective. I think the solidifying nature is when he sees all those people and all the results of what his memory thinks of how it's going on. And you see all the terror and the horror. It just brings a whole other light. And his conversation with Einstein towards the end just makes it even more timely than ever. And I think, again, Oppenheimer is one of the best films of this decade. But now we get to my top 2. And I know some people might be like, okay, why is this one at your number 2 and not your number 1? And to be honest with you, like, part of it's like, I just want to be a little bit different. But also, my number 1 is my number 1 for a reason. So we're going to talk about it in a second. But my number 2, Spider-Man Across the Spiderverse, which I think is personally one of my favorite films of all time now. I think it is one of the best animated films of all time. For people who don't know, Toy Story is my favorite film of all time. But I think if I grew up and in this decade, Across Spider-Verse probably would have been my favorite. Like, just growing up with this movie. I think it's the best Spider-Man movie ever made. I think it's just honestly amazing. And it's, again, one of those ones that I just couldn't stop recommending. And I think a lot of it is I'm waiting to see the telltale of the third film. I don't know what they're doing with it. And also, I didn't know if the second one was going to be as good as the first, and I think it's better. The first one for me is a masterpiece. It's a film. It was probably and honestly the most surprising movie I've ever seen in my entire life. I thought it was just going to be fine and cool, and I walked away blown away, and I couldn't stop telling people about that movie. And Across the Spider-Verse, I had higher expectations for, but also very nervous. And when I saw it for the first time in theaters, I can still vividly remember like looking over to my wife in like almost tears and my jaw on the floor from like just little things of like Spider-Man 2099 showing up and the way that the score comes about, which just to be honest with you, Across the Spider-Verse is probably my favorite score of the entire decade. But all those moments building up and then ending on such an insane cliffhanger, making me go, fuck, I need the next one. And I think a lot of this really is going to rely on how that third one it plays out. So part of that, I'm being a little bit trepidatious, being a little bit, calm in nature, because I don't know how you live up to this, but I love Across the Spider-Verse, and it's one of my favorite films of all time. It's one of my favorite films of this decade. Number one, it's a cheat. I know, I have to, but my number one is Dune. Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, the entire story of Paul Atreides in the first book. And I'm very excited to see Dune Messiah. But at this point, like, for some reason we didn't get Dune Messiah, I would still feel very relevant to what we have. And I think a lot of this just goes to Denis Villeneuve deserves his chops. He deserves his Oscar. He deserves everything for Dune. But the reason it's my number one, and fully honest, it blows my mind that we have not had a Star Wars film this decade yet. But the fact that Dune has come in and solidified itself as a box office achievement and a box office goal of sci-fi. I never thought Dune would hit any sort of point of the popular zeitgeist where I could go to work and like random people who I've never really talked to or like would never see as being a sci-fi head fucking love Dune. My dad as well, who likes sci-fi, loves the world of Dune, which like blows my mind because I never in a million years would have recommended this movie to him. But he loves the first Dune, and I don't even think he's seen the second part yet, but I know when he does, he's probably going to love it as well. And personally, for me, I think Dune Part 2 is better than Dune Part 1, but the way that Dune Part 2 is all built up and created about is, for me, just solidifies, like, when I look at the entire 2020s decade, by the end of it, we will have Dune Messiah. For me, we'll have this entire storyline to really be able to tell here, and a new sci-fi venture that only people will be able to fall in love with more and more. And the fact that it's going to, kind of take the place of Star Wars for this decade. I know we'll have a Star Wars film at least by next year with Mandalorian and Grogu, but I can't imagine that even being close to Dune. I don't even want to put that in the same sentence, but Dune is to like a whole other level. It feels real. It takes you to the world of Arrakis. Paul Atreides is like one of those characters that like you can understand what he's trying to do and then instantly hate him for what he's doing. Timothée Chalamet is amazing in it. Zendaya is incredible in it. Javier Bardem, I think, is fucking underrated in this. Austin Butler's amazing in Part 2. Every single thing about this film is masterful, is a masterpiece, is a cinematic masterpiece. And I think what Denis Villeneuve has done here is unlike anything else that anyone else could have possibly been able to see here. And I think, again, when I look at cinematic things and recommendations, Dune has been one of those for me. And I'm so happy, again, that Denis is finally getting that love, that praise, because I think personally, in this decade, him and Nolan are the two best directors working right now. That's my top 20 of the 2020s decade. A couple honorable mentions to kind of throw out there. John Wick Chapter 4, an amazing, I think, one of the best action films of this decade. Nope, kind of just warms up on me and more on each review watch. RRR, if you haven't seen it yet, you absolutely should. One Night in Miami, Defy Bloods, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, I was a massive fan of, and Marcel the Shell with Shoes On. Please let me know what films I missed out on or what films that you think should have been on this list. I have quite a few others. Maybe I'll do like a follow-up list. I also am planning to also maybe possibly do a top 20 video games of the decade so far. Let me know if you'd be interested in that. But of course, until next time, stay classy.